Before fear had a face, it had a heartbeat. Long before it learned language, before it learned ritual, before it learned prayer, the human body knew how to tremble. In the low light of a prehistoric dawn, fear was not an idea. It was a sensation moving through muscle and bone. A tightening of the chest. A sharpening of the senses. A silent command to run, to hide, to strike. This was not imagination. This was inheritance. Humanity did not awaken into the world fully formed and separate. It emerged slowly, painfully, from the long shadow of the animal kingdom. Our earliest ancestors did not stand above the wild. They lived inside it. They slept exposed beneath open skies. They listened constantly for footfalls in the dark. Every sound carried meaning, every stillness threatened death. Survival depended on instincts honed long before thought, a reflexive intelligence older than memory itself. In this world, fear was not an enemy. It was a guide. The pounding heart warned of danger before the eyes could see it. The sudden rush of adrenaline transformed fragile bodies into something faster, sharper, more enduring. Fear was not yet monstrous. It was protective. Kept children alive. It sharpened hunters. It whispered when something unseen moved just beyond the firelight. And yet, within this necessary terror, something else stirred. A recognition. Early humans did not only fear the beasts that stalked them, they recognized them. In their speed, their hunger, their capacity for violence, humans saw reflections of themselves. The line between prey and predator was thin and shifting. To hunt was to imitate the animals one feared. To survive was to adopt their behaviors, their patience, their ruthlessness. The human body learned to become animal when needed. Anthropology traces this relationship not through myth, but through bone and pigment. Cave walls across Europe, Africa, and Asia bear witness to a world where animals dominated the human imagination. Bison, lions, mammoths, and wolves appear again and again, rendered with reverence, precision, and awe. Humans, when depicted at all, often appear distorted or incomplete. The animal was central. Humanity, still uncertain of itself, stood at the margins. These images were not decoration. They were memory made visible. They preserved a truth early humans understood intuitively: that the animal world was not separate from the human one. It surrounded them, sustained them, and threatened them in equal measure. To know the animal was to know life itself. To misunderstand it was to die. But beneath this reverence lay a quieter unease. Animals killed without malice. They consumed without guilt. They followed hunger and instinct with absolute clarity. Humans, however, began to hesitate. As self-awareness deepened, so did a strange discomfort with their own impulses. The same hands that crafted tools and tended fires were capable of tearing flesh. The same mouths that spoke comfort could release screams of rage. Something within the human mind had begun to observe itself, and what it saw was unsettling. This was the first fracture. The moment when instinct was no longer seamless, when the animal within became something to notice rather than simply obey. Fear changed shape. It was no longer only about what lurked outside the camp. Turned inward. What if the danger was not just the predator in the darkness, but the capacity for violence carried inside the human body itself? Psychology would one day name this inheritance. Neuroscience would map it in neural pathways and chemical responses. But tens of thousands of years ago there were no words for it. Only sensation. A sudden surge of aggression. A loss of control. A trance-like state in moments of threat or hunger. These experiences felt both empowering and frightening, as if something ancient had risen up from beneath the surface of the self. The animal within did not ask permission. Across cultures and continents, early humans responded not by denying this force, but by ritualizing it. They painted themselves with ochre. They wore skins and teeth. They danced, mimicked, and transformed. These were not performances. They were negotiations. Attempts to reconcile the thinking mind with the instinctual body. To honor the animal without becoming lost within it. In this fragile balance, fear remained close. Not fear of death alone, but fear of forgetting what it meant to be human, or worse, realizing that humanity was never as distant from the beast as it wished to believe. The animal within was not an intruder. It was ancestral. It carried the memory of survival across uncounted generations. It remembered famine, pursuit, and blood-soaked earth. And it did not disappear simply because humans began to name themselves differently. As time passed and societies slowly took shape, this tension would deepen. The instincts that once ensured survival would become dangerous in a world of cooperation and restraint. What had been necessary would become shameful. What had once saved lives would later threaten social order. But in this earliest chapter of human history, none of that had yet hardened into doctrine. There was only the body, the breath, and the quiet knowledge that beneath thought lived something older. Fear in these early moments was not mythic. It did not wear fangs or fur. It had no story yet, no monster's name. It was simply the recognition that humanity was not separate from nature, but formed by it, and that the line dividing human and animal was not a wall, but a membrane. Permeable, always trembling. Long after tools improved and languages formed, this memory would persist. It would surface in dreams of pursuit, in sudden flashes of rage, in the inexplicable comfort of the fire and the equally inexplicable dread of the dark. Civilization would rise, but it would never erase the body's older wisdom. Because before fear became a story, before it became a monster, before it became something to banish or explain away, it lived where it still lives now. Inside the human heart, beating with the echo of claws. Night came differently before walls, before laws, before the promise of morning felt certain. It did not arrive gently. It descended, thick, absolute, and alive with unseen movement. When the sun vanished beyond the horizon of the ancient world, it took with it more than light. It stripped early humans of certainty. Vision failed. Distance collapsed. The world shrank to what could be heard, smelled, or suddenly felt against the skin. In this darkness, instinct ruled. Long before clocks divided time, night was not merely an absence of day. It was a domain. Predators claimed it. Cold deepened within it. Sounds multiplied without source. A snapped twig could signal death. A silence that lingered too long could mean something was watching. To survive the night required a body attuned to danger before thought could intervene. Human physiology adapted accordingly. The brain learned vigilance. Sleep came in fragments. Muscles rested lightly, ready to spring. Fear sharpened perception, transforming shadow into signal. This was not imagination but evolutionary necessity. Those who ignored the night did not endure it. Anthropological evidence suggests that early humans were neither purely diurnal nor safely nocturnal. They existed in a liminal state, vulnerable in both realms. Unlike many predators, they lacked natural weapons. Unlike many prey animals, they lacked speed. What they possessed instead was adaptability. And instinct was its engine. At night, decision-making bypassed deliberation. The body reacted before the mind could doubt. Fight or flight was not a metaphor but a lived rhythm, rehearsed nightly beneath starless skies. In moments of threat, something ancient surged forward, quieting reflection and amplifying action. This state was not reasoned. It was embodied. And yet, within this instinctive clarity, fear became intimate. Darkness forced early humans into proximity with themselves. In daylight the world could be read. Tracks were visible. Threats could be measured. At night, meaning dissolved. The unseen gained power. The mind filled gaps left by the eyes, and imagination, still untrained, still raw, began to stir. This was not yet myth. But it was its soil. Across cultures, night would later become associated with transformation, possession, and loss of self. These associations were not arbitrary. They were born here, in the long prehistoric nights when instinct took precedence over identity. When hunger, exhaustion, and fear stripped humans of the social masks they would later learn to wear. In the dark, the body remembered what it was capable of. Hunting often occurred at dawn or dusk, transitional hours where vision and shadow overlapped. In these moments, humans learned to move silently, to read subtle cues, to anticipate movement. These skills mirrored those of predators. To hunt successfully, humans had to think like animals, had to feel the terrain, the wind, the tension of pursuit. This was not symbolic. It was practical. But repetition carved something deeper. Over time, the act of entering a predatory state, heightened, focused, ruthless, became recognizable. A shift occurred. The human stepped into a different mode of being. One where empathy quieted and efficiency took its place. The night welcomed this transformation. Fire offered some defense, but it also cast flickering shadows that distorted form and scale. Faces stretched across cave walls. Limbs merged with rock. Movement became ambiguous. In this unstable light, the boundary between human and animal blurred not only in behavior, but in perception. A crouched figure could resemble a beast. A beast could appear almost human. These moments imprinted themselves deeply. They taught the mind that identity was not fixed, that shape could change with light, with posture, with intent. Later myths of transformation would echo this realization, but here it was lived, not narrated. Psychologically, night strips away abstraction. Modern studies suggest that darkness heightens emotional reactivity and reduces perceived control. In prehistoric contexts, this effect would have been magnified. Without artificial light, night was total. It erased distance and orientation. It placed the human nervous system into a state of continuous alert. In such a state, instinct did not merely guide behavior, it defined it. And instinct, unlike reason, does not distinguish between human and animal categories. It responds to threat, hunger, dominance, and survival. It speaks a language older than morality. When instinct ruled the night, humans did not ask what was right. They asked what would keep them alive until dawn. This reality shaped early social bonds. Groups huddled together not only for warmth, but for reassurance. The presence of others regulated fear. Shared breathing, shared vigilance, shared silence. Isolation at night was perilous. To be alone after dark was to be exposed, to the world and to oneself. It is here that the earliest emotional undercurrents of fear took form. Not fear of monsters, but fear of abandonment. Fear of losing the group. Fear of becoming prey. These fears lingered. They embedded themselves into the human psyche, surviving long after nights grew safer. Even today, the dark unsettles not because of what we see, but because of what we feel returning. A subtle loosening of control. A readiness we cannot fully explain. The night remembers us. As human cognition evolved, instinct did not vanish, it receded. Daylight became the realm of planning, language, and social order. Night remained something else. Reminder. A space where older patterns still surfaced. Dreams intensified. Emotions deepened. The unconscious stirred. Civilization would later assign stories to this divide. Gods of night. Spirits of shadow. Beasts that emerged only after sunset. But these narratives came later. Long before they were spoken, the truth was already inscribed in the body. When instinct ruled the night, humans learned that beneath thought lived something vigilant, responsive, and untamed. Something that did not disappear with progress. Something that waited for darkness to return. And even now, when lights banish the shadows and walls keep the wild at bay, night still carries a subtle authority. It lowers our defenses. It invites memory. It reminds the human mind of a time when survival depended not on belief or knowledge, but on listening to the animal within, as it kept watch in the dark. There came a moment in human history when instinct was no longer enough. Fear had been felt, endured, and survived, but it had not yet been understood. As awareness deepened, early humans sought a way to approach the forces that shaped their lives without being consumed by them. They did not turn away from the animal. They turned toward it, with intention. This was the birth of transformation. Across continents and millennia, humans began to alter their own appearance in deliberate, symbolic ways. They painted their faces with ash and ochre. They fastened antlers to their heads, draped themselves in hides, adorned their bodies with teeth, claws, and bone. These were not disguises meant to deceive others. They were thresholds, ritual acts meant to cross from one state of being into another, to where the animal was to invite it closer. Archaeology preserves traces of this impulse in places where language has not survived. In Upper Paleolithic sites, burials include animal remains arranged with care, skulls placed near human heads, claws sewn into clothing, horns positioned as if still alive. These choices speak not of decoration, but of belief. The dead were not sent onward alone. They were accompanied by the essence of the animal, its strength, its vigilance, its endurance beyond death. In cave art, figures appear that defy clear classification. Bodies shaped like humans but crowned with antlers. Limbs elongated into paws. Faces half beast, half man. These images do not tell stories in sequence. They hover. They suggest a state of becoming rather than a completed form. Anthropologists often refer to these figures as shamans, though the word itself is far younger than the images it attempts to describe. What matters is not the title, but the function. These individuals stood at the boundary between worlds, between human society and the forces that lay beyond it. They did not dominate the animal realm. They negotiated with it. Ritual offered structure to fear. Where instinct was chaotic, ritual was precise. Movements repeated. Gestures learned. Symbols agreed upon. Through repetition, humans created moments where the unpredictable could be approached safely. The animal was no longer only an external threat or an internal impulse. It became a presence that could be summoned, honored, and dismissed. Masks played a central role in this process. A mask does not erase identity. Suspends it. When the human face vanished behind carved wood, bone, or hide, something shifted, not only in how others perceived the wearer, but in how the wearer perceived themselves. The mind loosened its grip. The body took precedence. Movement changed. Voice altered. The mask allowed humans to step outside the boundaries of the self without losing their place in the community. Psychologically, this was profound. Modern studies of ritual and embodiment suggest that altered appearance can induce altered states of consciousness. The brain responds to symbolism as if it were reality. For early humans, this effect would have been magnified by belief, environment, and necessity. The mask was not pretend. It was permission. Permission to hunt with greater ferocity. Permission to endure pain. Permission to confront fear without retreat. In becoming animal, humans did not abandon their humanity, they expanded it. This impulse appears independently across cultures separated by oceans and epochs. In the Arctic, hunters invoked the spirits of seals and bears. In the Americas, dancers became jaguars, wolves, and eagles. In Africa and Australia, animal embodiment marked initiation, healing, and contact with the ancestral past. The consistency of this pattern suggests something universal. When humans sought power, they sought it through the animal. Yet beneath reverence lay caution. To become too animal was dangerous. Rituals were bounded by time, place, and rule for a reason. The transformation had to end. The mask had to be removed. The hunter had to return to the fire and rejoin the group. Without this return, the boundary dissolved. The individual risked losing themselves to the very force they sought to harness. This fear of not coming back quietly shaped early belief systems. It marked the first recognition that identity was fragile, that the human self could be loosened, reshaped, or even swallowed by something older and more instinctive. The animal was powerful, but it was indifferent. It did not care for kinship, memory, or meaning. Humans did. Ritual thus became a balancing act, a way to touch the wild without being claimed by it. The mask allowed transformation without permanence. It created a controlled descent into instinct and a structured ascent back into society. Over time, these practices accumulated layers of meaning. The animal became ancestor, guardian, teacher. Certain clans aligned themselves with specific creatures, binding identity to mythic lineage. To belong was to share not just blood, but symbol. The animal was woven into the fabric of community, shaping behavior, values, and taboo. But the core truth remained unchanged. Humans did not imagine animals because they admired them. They imagined them because they recognized themselves within them. The mask was not a lie. It was a mirror. As settlements grew and social roles became more defined, these rituals did not disappear. They retreated. They moved to the edges of society, to liminal spaces. Forests, caves, mountaintops. Places where the rules softened and the old fears could surface safely. The animal remained present, but increasingly distant. Later civilizations would reinterpret these practices. They would call them primitive, superstitious, dangerous. But their persistence tells another story. Even as humans built cities and codified law, the need to step outside the human shape endured. Because beneath language and law, the body still remembered. It remembered the power of becoming something else. It remembered the relief of surrendering control. It remembered that fear could be worn, danced, and survived. The masks of bone and fur were never about hiding. They were about revealing what could not yet be spoken. That the human self was not singular. That identity was layered. And that somewhere beneath thought and name, the animal still waited, patient, ancient, and ready to be called forth. As human imagination matured, fear did not disappear. It ascended. What once lurked in forests and shadows began to rise into the sky, to take shape not merely as animals, but as gods. And these gods did not abandon the wild. They carried it with them, etched into horns, wings, claws, and fangs. The earliest divinities were rarely human in form. Across ancient civilizations, the sacred was imagined as hybrid. Part man, part beast, entirely other. These were not aesthetic choices. They were psychological truths made visible. Power to early humans did not look like kindness. It looked like dominance, unpredictability, and strength beyond comprehension. In Mesopotamia, gods bore leonine bodies and avian wings. In Egypt, divinity wore the heads of jackals, falcons, crocodiles, and lions. In the Indus Valley and Mesoamerica, serpents and jaguars became vessels of cosmic authority. These beings ruled not because they resembled humanity, but because they did not. Their animal features signaled a closeness to forces humans could neither tame nor fully understand. The animal god was fear given order. Where raw terror once struck without meaning, divinity provided explanation. Storms, droughts, disease, and death were no longer random. They were expressions of will. The beastly form of the god reflected the nature of the threat itself. Predatory, swift, merciless. To worship such a being was not to love it, but to acknowledge it. These gods were not moral in the modern sense. They did not reward virtue consistently or punish cruelty reliably. They demanded recognition, sacrifice, and obedience. Their favor was conditional, their anger catastrophic. Like animals, they responded to provocation and neglect with equal intensity. Anthropologically, this marks a critical shift. Fear was no longer only a biological response or a ritualized transformation. It became cosmological. The animal within was projected outward, magnified to the scale of the universe. What humans feared about themselves, their violence, their hunger, their lack of control, was now embedded in the structure of reality itself. Psychologically, this offered relief. If the gods were beasts, then human brutality was not aberration. It was echo. War, bloodshed, and dominance could be framed as alignment with divine order rather than moral failure. The animal instinct found justification not just in survival, but in sacred narrative. Yet reverence was always laced with dread. Temples were built not as places of comfort, but as boundaries. Sacred spaces marked zones where humans approached the inhuman under strict rules. Priests acted as intermediaries, shielding the community from direct contact with divine volatility. Ritual precision mattered. Mistakes were dangerous. To offend a god with teeth was to invite ruin. This fear shaped early ethics. Not compassion but restraint. Not goodness but balance. Humans learned not to eradicate their animal impulses, but to contain them, much as the gods themselves were contained within myth, idol, and ceremony. Over time, these hybrid deities began to shift. As societies stabilized and hierarchies hardened, gods slowly took on more human forms. Teeth dulled. Claws vanished. Power became abstract. Law, wisdom, kingship. But the older gods did not disappear. They receded into the margins, into underworlds, forests, and forbidden cults. They became dangerous gods, forgotten gods, monstrous gods. Yet even in exile, they retained their grip on the human imagination. Stories warned of what happened when their domains were violated. When humans hunted where they should not. When they forgot humility. When they believed themselves separate from the forces that shaped them. The gods with teeth served as reminders. They reminded humanity that civilization was fragile. That beneath law and order lay older rules written in blood and instinct. That nature did not negotiate. Consumed. And perhaps most unsettling of all, these gods reflected an uncomfortable truth. Humans trusted animal power more than human virtue. Strength inspired belief. Ferocity commanded respect. Mercy came later, long after fear had already defined the sacred. Even today, echoes remain. Monsters, demons, and dark gods still bear animal traits. We continue to imagine ultimate power as something predatory, watching, capable of sudden violence. The shape has changed, but the instinct has not. Because long before gods became human, humans made gods into beasts, and in doing so, confessed what they had always known. That the divine was not gentle. That fear deserved reverence. And that somewhere beyond reason, the universe still had teeth. Long before temples rose or prayers found words, the hunt was humanity's first ritual. It unfolded not in sanctuaries, but across open plains and shadowed forests, where survival and meaning were bound together by blood. To hunt was not merely to kill, it was to remember what the world demanded of those who wished to remain within it. In the earliest human communities, the hunt structured time itself. Days prepared for it. Nights anticipated it. Success meant nourishment, warmth, and life. Failure meant hunger that lingered in the bones. This weight transformed the act of hunting into something more than necessity. It became an event charged with gravity, repetition, and reverence. Archaeological traces reveal this reverence in subtle ways. Animal remains arranged with care. Bones marked, not discarded. Skulls placed apart, sometimes elevated, sometimes buried with intention. These gestures suggest that prey was not viewed as inert matter, but as presence, something acknowledged even in death. The animal was taken but not forgotten. This memory was not sentimental. It was reciprocal. Humans understood that to live, something else must die. The hunt forced early societies to confront this truth repeatedly, without abstraction or distance. Each kill reaffirmed a relationship with the world that was intimate and irreversible. Cave paintings preserve this relationship with haunting clarity. Scenes of pursuit stretch across stone walls, frozen in motion. Spears mid-flight. Bodies leaning forward in unison. Animals rendered with detail and care, their mass and movement unmistakable. Humans appear smaller, often faceless, sometimes reduced to lines. The focus is not triumph, but tension. These images are not celebrations of dominance. They are records of engagement. Anthropologists suggest that such art functioned as memory and instruction. To paint the hunt was to study it, to understand animal behavior, migration, strength, and vulnerability. But the repetition of these scenes points to something deeper. The hunt was replayed not because it was glorious, but because it was essential. It anchored human identity in action, risk, and consequence. Psychologically, the hunt demanded a suspension of everyday social rules. Compassion, hesitation, and familiarity had to give way to precision. This shift was temporary but profound. Hunters entered a focused state where the world narrowed, senses sharpened, and emotion quieted. In this state, the animal within the human resurfaced, not as chaos but as clarity. This experience left an imprint. Returning from the hunt required reintegration. Meat was shared. Stories were told. Ritual gestures acknowledged both success and loss. These acts restored balance, reminding the community that violence had a place, but not a permanence. Without such rituals, the boundary between hunter and predator risked erosion. The sacred nature of the hunt emerged from this tension. It was not worship of killing, but respect for its necessity. Many cultures developed taboos around hunting certain animals or during certain times. Others believed animals offered themselves willingly, requiring gratitude rather than conquest. These beliefs softened the psychological burden of taking life while preserving its seriousness. Over generations, the hunt became mythic memory. Ancestors were remembered as great hunters. Animals became teachers, tricksters, or spirits. Stories preserved lessons learned through blood and hunger, translating lived experience into narrative form. Through myth, the hunt endured even as lifestyles shifted. As agriculture emerged and reliance on hunting diminished, these memories did not fade. They transformed. Gods inherited hunting traits. Heroes proved themselves through pursuit. Festivals reenacted ancient chases. Even when meat came from fields and pens, the symbolism of the hunt remained potent. Why did it endure? Because the hunt was the moment when humanity most clearly confronted itself. In the animals' eyes, humans saw reflection. In the act of pursuit, they felt their own capacity for violence. In the kill, they understood the cost of survival. The hunt stripped away illusion. It left only necessity and choice. Civilization would later place distance between humans and death. Tools improved. Processes hid blood. Responsibility diffused. But the memory of the hunt remained embedded in the psyche, resurfacing in dreams, stories, and rituals of competition and conquest. Even today, echoes persist. The language of pursuit shapes ambition. The thrill of the chase animates conflict. The satisfaction of conquest still carries a shadow of ancient hunger. These impulses are remnants, not of savagery, but of remembrance. The hunt was never only about food. It was about learning where humanity stood in the world. Not above it, not apart from it, but within it, bound by tooth and spear, by need and consequence, by a memory written into muscle and bone. And though the world has changed, that memory remains, waiting beneath the surface, a sacred echo of the moment when survival and meaning were one. There came a quiet turning point in human history, one without fire or blood to mark it, a shift not in tools but in thought. As humans began to settle, to build, to name rules and roles, instinct slowly lost its innocence. What had once been necessary began to feel dangerous. The animal within, once trusted, was now watched with suspicion. This was the birth of shame. With permanent shelters came permanence of memory. Actions no longer vanished with the sunrise. They lingered in reputation, in story, in consequence. Aggression that once saved lives could now fracture communities. Hunger-driven impulses clashed with shared storage and shared responsibility. Survival was no longer solitary or immediate. It was collective. And instinct did not always cooperate. Where early humans once flowed seamlessly between restraint and ferocity, emerging societies demanded consistency, predictability, control. The body, however, still carried older rhythms. Rage surged. Desire flared. Fear overpowered reason. When these moments disrupted social order, they were no longer explained as necessity, but as failure. The animal was reclassified. Anthropological evidence suggests that as hierarchy and law emerged, so too did moral distinction. Certain behaviors were elevated as human, others condemned as base. Come over frenzy, planning over impulse, obedience over hunger. The same instincts once honored in the hunt were now tolerated only in narrow contexts, or forbidden entirely. This tension lodged itself in the body. Psychologically, shame is not fear of harm but fear of exposure. It arises when the self becomes aware of how it is seen. As communities grew denser and more interdependent, this awareness intensified. Humans began to monitor themselves not only for survival, but for acceptability. The animal within did not disappear. It became something to hide. Myth absorbed this transformation. Stories shifted from animals as teachers to animals as warnings. Beasts came to represent temptation, chaos, and loss of control. Hybrid figures that once symbolized power now marked transgression. To become animal was no longer sacred. It was a fall, a regression, punishment. In many traditions, the boundary between human and beast hardened into law. To cross it was to invite exile, curse, or death. The werewolf, the berserker, the shapeshifter. These figures embody not admiration, but anxiety. They reflect the fear that beneath social order lurks something uncontrollable, waiting for weakness. Shame gave that fear language. Religiously, this shift deepened. As moral systems formalized, instinct became associated with impurity. Hunger became gluttony. Desire became sin. Rage became evil. The body itself grew suspect, a vessel of impulses that threatened the soul's discipline. The animal was no longer a partner in survival, but an adversary within. And yet, suppression came at a cost. What is denied does not vanish. It accumulates. The instincts humans learned to bury did not dissolve. They resurfaced under pressure. In famine. In war. In moments of collective panic. When order collapsed, the animal returned with force, often more violent for having been restrained. History bears this out. Periods of rigid control are often followed by eruptions of brutality. The language used to describe such moments is revealing. People are said to descend, to lose humanity, to become animals. These phrases do not describe change. They describe recognition. The animal was always there. Shame, then, was never a cure. It was a negotiation strategy. A way to keep instinct contained long enough for civilization to function. It taught humans when to restrain themselves, but not how to reconcile with what they were restraining. This unresolved tension shaped the inner life. Guilt became internalized. Dreams filled with pursuit and teeth. Stories warned children of beasts waiting beyond the village edge. Fear no longer lived only in the forest. It lived in the self. The body remembered what the mind rejected. Even as language refined identity, the nervous system retained its older wiring. Stress still triggered fight or flight. Anger still surged before thought. Desire still bypassed reason. Shame arose not because these responses existed, but because humans believed they should not. This belief reshaped humanity's relationship with fear. No longer merely a signal of danger, fear became a signal of moral failure. To feel it too strongly was weakness. To act on instinct was disgrace. The animal within became something to discipline, confess, or punish. Yet the irony endured. Civilization depended on the very instincts it condemned. Protection, aggression, territoriality, loyalty. These traits were praised in warriors and rulers, even as they were suppressed in daily life. The animal was unacceptable, until it was required. Shame did not erase the beast. It taught humans to look away from it. And in that act of turning inward, of judging their own nature, humanity crossed a threshold as profound as any tool or fire. Fear had entered the body in a new way. Not as survival, but as self-awareness. And from that moment on, the struggle was no longer only against the wild beyond the walls, but against the animal that still lived beneath the skin. The monster was not discovered. It was assembled. As human societies grew more complex, fear required a new shape, one that could be named, blamed, and placed safely outside the self. Instinct had become shameful. Violence had become transgressive. Yet the impulses did not fade. They searched for form. And so, humanity gave them bodies. This was the moment the monster was born. Across early mythologies, creatures began to appear that were neither fully human nor fully animal, but something fractured between the two. They prowled borders and thresholds, forests beyond the fields, mountains beyond the road, nights beyond the fire's reach. These beings did not belong anywhere civilized. They existed to mark the edge. The monster was the animal exiled. Where ritual once allowed controlled transformation, myth now warned against it. To cross the boundary too fully was to lose one's place among humans. The shapeshifter became a cautionary figure, not a mediator but a failure of restraint. A body overtaken by appetite, a mind undone by instinct. In this shift, fear found clarity. Anthropologically, monsters emerge most clearly in cultures undergoing social consolidation. As law, kinship, and hierarchy strengthened, so too did anxiety about deviation. Communities needed symbols that defined what could not be tolerated. The monster served this function perfectly. It was everything the society feared becoming. Hair where skin should be. Teeth where speech belonged. Hunger without limit. These creatures were not random inventions. They were precise exaggerations of human traits stripped of restraint. Rage without reason. Desire without consent. Violence without loyalty. The monster was humanity with the brakes removed. Psychologically, this externalization offered relief. If the worst impulses could be placed into a creature beyond the village, then the community could preserve the illusion of internal purity. The beast was no longer within, it was out there, waiting. But the stories betrayed the truth. Monsters were rarely born monstrous. Many myths insist on an origin. A curse, a betrayal, a moment of weakness. A human who crossed the line and could not return. This detail mattered. It preserved a quiet warning. That monstrosity was not foreign. It was potential. The werewolf does not arrive from the wild. He emerges from the home. This pattern repeats across cultures. The berserker who loses himself in battle. The vampire who feeds endlessly. The demon born of forbidden knowledge. Each represents an excess, an instinct allowed to dominate identity. The monster is not chaos incarnate. It is imbalance. Civilization defined itself by contrast. To be human was to control appetite. To be rational. To delay gratification. The monster embodied failure in all three. It reminded societies of what happened when boundaries dissolved, when the animal reclaimed authority. Yet monsters also fascinated. They drew attention because they expressed what daily life suppressed. In stories, listeners could approach danger without consequence. They could feel fear, rage, and awe safely contained within narrative. The monster allowed the community to experience forbidden emotions collectively, without acting on them. This made monsters durable. They adapted as societies changed. As religious frameworks deepened, monsters absorbed moral weight. They became punishments, temptations, or trials sent by higher powers. As medicine evolved, they were linked to disease, madness, and contagion. Each era reshaped the monster, but never erased it. Because the need remained. Humans required figures that explained violence without accepting responsibility for it. War crimes were blamed on beasts within men. Atrocities were described as inhuman. Even today the language persists. We do not say people committed horrors, we say monsters did. This linguistic distancing reveals discomfort, not truth. The monster exists to protect the idea of humanity. But myth is rarely so easily fooled. In many traditions, monsters speak. They reason. They remember who they were. Their tragedy lies not only in what they do, but in what they have lost. These stories carry an undercurrent of recognition, a sense that the monster is not entirely other. It is familiar. The birth of the monster marked a turning point in human consciousness. Fear was no longer just a response or a ritual. It became narrative. A story with shape, cause, and consequence. Through monsters, humanity learned to fear itself indirectly. And yet, in every telling something slips through. A reminder that the line between human and monster is not drawn in blood or fur, but in restraint. That monstrosity is not born, it is allowed. That when fear is denied rather than understood, it does not disappear. Wait. At the edge of the village. At the edge of the mind. The monster was never just a warning about the world beyond civilization. It was a confession. That beneath order and law, beneath shame and story, the animal still remembered what it was capable of. And that humanity, for all its walls and words, was never entirely certain it could keep it contained. There are moments when fear abandons logic and enters the body without invitation. When behavior fractures. When familiar faces become unrecognizable. Long before science attempted to name these states, humanity searched for meaning in the sky above, and found it reflected in the moon. Night had always unsettled the human mind, but the moon transformed it. Unlike the sun, it did not banish darkness. It revealed it slowly, incompletely, casting silver light that distorted shape and depth. Under moonlight, the world felt altered, familiar yet unreliable. Shadows lengthened, edges softened. Time seemed to loosen its grip. In this uncertain light, madness found a story. Across cultures, episodes of sudden violence, dissociation, and altered behavior were linked to lunar cycles. The term lunacy itself preserves this ancient association. People noticed patterns. Not precise, not scientific, but persistent. Some individuals changed at night. Others changed under the full moon. When reason failed, myth stepped in. The beast returned. Shapeshifter legends flourished where psychology had no language. The werewolf, the skinwalker, the night roamer. These figures offered explanation for behavior that frightened communities. A man who killed without memory. A woman who wandered naked into the forest. A neighbor who spoke in voices not his own. Such events demanded meaning. Myth provided containment. Rather than confront the fragility of the human mind, societies externalized the cause. Madness was not internal, it was possession. Transformation. Earth. The animal was blamed because it already carried symbolic weight. It was instinct unbound, reason eclipsed, flesh overtaking thought. Psychologically, this projection was protective. To accept that identity could fracture spontaneously was terrifying. It threatened the foundations of moral responsibility and social trust. If anyone could lose themselves without warning, then order was an illusion. The monster preserved order by isolating disorder into a form that could be named and feared. Moonlight became the trigger. The moon does not cause madness, but it illuminates vulnerability. In pre-modern societies, full moons extended activity into the night. Sleep patterns shifted. Fatigue accumulated. Emotional regulation weakened. For those already near psychological thresholds, these conditions could amplify instability. The pattern felt real because it was felt, and feeling shaped belief. The body in altered states often behaves in ways that resemble animal instinct. Speech falters. Inhibition dissolves. Movement becomes erratic or predatory. To observers, such behavior looked like transformation, not metaphorical but literal. The human seemed to recede as something older emerged. These moments terrified not only because they were violent, but because they were familiar. Everyone had felt flashes of irrational rage. Everyone had sensed impulses that did not align with identity or values. Madness made visible what most worked hard to suppress. The monster was not frightening because it was strange, but because it was recognizable. In folklore, those afflicted were often victims as much as threats. Cursed by ancestry. Marked by birth. Doomed by forces beyond control. These narratives carried quiet compassion. They acknowledged suffering without confronting its source directly. Religion absorbed this tension. Madness became evidence of spiritual imbalance. Demonic influence. Punishment or trial. Rituals of exorcism replaced earlier transformation rites. Where masks once allowed safe descent into instinct, now prayer attempted to banish it entirely. But banishment never held. The more societies insisted on rational self-control, the more monstrous loss of control appeared. As shame deepened, madness became more frightening, not less. The animal within, now denied expression, surfaced violently when restraint failed. Even today, language echoes this fear. People are said to snap, to lose it, to go feral. These phrases betray the same ancient anxiety, that beneath identity lies something volatile, waiting for circumstance to strip away order. Moonlight remains symbolic because it reflects without warmth. It shows without protecting. It reminds the human mind that clarity is conditional, that under certain pressures, anyone can become unfamiliar to themselves. The stories were never truly about the moon. They were about permission. Permission for fear to explain what reason could not. Permission for society to isolate instability. Permission to believe that madness came from elsewhere. But the truth lingered beneath every tale. The beast did not arrive from the sky. It rose from within. Madness, moonlight, and flesh converged because they all revealed the same unsettling reality. That identity is not fixed, that selfhood can fracture, and that the line between human and animal is not crossed through curse, but through loss of control. And in recognizing that, humanity faced one of its deepest fears. Not that monsters exist, but that, under the right darkness, anyone might become one. Civilization did not arise gently. It pressed itself into the landscape with walls, borders, and rules, each one a declaration against uncertainty. Where the wild had once dictated survival, humans now attempted something radical: control. And control required an enemy. That enemy was the wild itself. As settlements expanded into towns and cities, the relationship between humans and nature shifted from coexistence to opposition. Forests were cleared. Animals were driven back. Paths replaced tracks. The unknown was no longer a teacher. It was a threat. To civilize meant to separate, to define where humanity ended and where danger began. Law became the instrument of that separation. Early legal codes did more than regulate behavior between people. They regulated humanity's place in the world. Certain spaces were forbidden. Certain acts condemned. Certain instincts punished. Violence was no longer contextual, it was criminal. Hunger was no longer excuse, it was theft. The animal logic of survival was rewritten as transgression. The wild was pushed outward. In myth and memory, forests became places of exile. Those who broke the law were cast beyond the boundary, into landscapes populated by beasts and spirits. This was not coincidence. The wilderness symbolized what law sought to suppress: instability, unpredictability, and instinct unbound by agreement. To leave the city was to risk becoming something else. Anthropologically, this division marks a profound psychological shift. Humans no longer understood themselves as part of a living system, but as its managers. Nature became resource, threat, or backdrop. The animal within, once mirrored by the world outside, now had no reflection except in forbidden spaces and monstrous figures. Law promised safety, but it demanded restraint. Social order required predictable behavior. Emotions were regulated. Roles assigned. Impulse disciplined. The body became subject to oversight. In this environment, instinct was not only discouraged, it was dangerous. The person who acted too quickly, too violently, too passionately threatened the structure holding everyone together. Fear changed shape again. No longer centered on predators or darkness, fear became social. Fear of punishment, fear of exile, fear of becoming an outcast. Shame deepened its grip, reinforced by written codes and collective enforcement. The wild was no longer something humans feared encountering. It was something they feared becoming. Stories preserved this anxiety. Folklore filled the wilderness with consequences. Those who entered too far were transformed. Children were warned not to stray. Adults were reminded of what waited beyond the light. These tales were not merely about geography. They were moral maps. To cross certain boundaries, physical or behavioral, was to forfeit humanity. Yet the wild never vanished. It pressed against the edges of civilization, resisting erasure. Crops failed. Animals returned. Storms ignored borders. And within the human body, instinct continued to surface, especially under strain. When famine struck or war erupted, law faltered. In these moments, the animal re-emerged, not as myth, but as necessity. History records this pattern repeatedly. Periods of strict order are followed by collapse. When systems fail, humans revert quickly to older logics. Food, territory, protection. The veneer of civilization thins. Violence intensifies. And once again language shifts. People speak of savagery, of regression, of losing humanity. But humanity was never lost. It was reprioritized. Law did not eliminate the wild. Delayed it. This realization haunted early societies. They understood intuitively that order was fragile, that walls could be breached, that rules required constant reinforcement. The wild was not defeated. It was contained, watched, and feared. Rulers embodied this tension. Kings were expected to be restrained yet ruthless, lawful yet violent when necessary. They stood at the boundary between civilization and chaos, authorized to act where others could not. In them, society allowed a controlled return of the animal. But this exception revealed the truth. Civilization needed what it condemned. The wild provided strength, adaptability, and resilience. Law provided structure and continuity. Neither could fully replace the other. Yet reconciliation was rare. Instead, humanity chose opposition, defining itself by what it excluded. The forest became the other. The beast became the warning. The law became the line. And still, beneath stone streets and written codes, something stirred. A memory older than contracts and crowns. A reminder that order was an agreement, not a law of nature. Because no matter how carefully humanity drew its borders, the wild remained close, waiting in unlit places, in unguarded moments, and in the quiet truth that civilization is not the absence of instinct, but the effort to live beside it without being consumed. Even when the sun rose over stone streets and cultivated fields, the human mind remained haunted by what lurked beyond and within. Civilization had extended its reach, but it could not illuminate the unconscious. Sleep became the arena where instinct, fear, and memory intertwined, weaving narratives humans could neither fully control nor ignore. Dreams preserved the animal within. Across cultures, sleep was never simple rest. It was a journey, a rehearsal, a negotiation with instincts long denied. Hunters dreamt of pursuit. Children dreamed of beasts. Elders dreamed of past lives and ancestral forests. In these nocturnal narratives, humans confronted the impulses they suppressed in daylight: rage, hunger, desire, and violence. In dreams, instinct regained its voice. Anthropologists suggest that dreaming functioned as both rehearsal and warning. The body, the nervous system, and the mind processed experiences that daily life could not resolve. A dream of being chased by a wolf or a lion was not merely fear. It was training. It rehearsed vigilance, survival, and awareness. It reminded the dreamer of capacities that civilization demanded they suppress, yet could never erase. Folklore amplified these nocturnal truths. Across continents, stories of night visitors, werewolves, skinwalkers, horned spirits, emerged from the intersection of dream and memory. These figures were liminal, existing between worlds, between human and animal. They were warnings and mirrors. They demonstrated what could happen if instinct went unheeded, if restraint failed, if shame became obsession. The recurring theme is clear. Humans imagined themselves as beasts because the body remembered what the mind sought to deny. Dreams made literal what daylight masked. In nocturnal landscapes, humans could explore ferocity safely, confront desire without consequence, and witness transformation without risk. These visions were, in effect, ritual without ceremony. Psychologically, dreams also reinforced social norms. The monstrous visitor punished transgression, reflected anxiety, and reinforced moral boundaries. Yet they also carried a strange permission to experience instinct, violence, and fear vicariously, to imagine the animal without succumbing to it. Dreams became a theater for negotiation, a place to confront what civilization could not safely allow in waking life. Symbolism deepened this process. Claws, fangs, and fur were never arbitrary. They connected the sleeper to an ancestral past, to instincts that had once ensured survival. In seeing themselves as animals or encountering them, They reaffirmed human dependence on instinct even as they affirmed their distance from it. Dreams became a bridge between the suppressed and the expressed, the conscious and the inherited. Art, myth, and ritual often mirrored these dreamscapes. Cave paintings, masks, and stories preserved nocturnal encounters in visible form. They codified the experience, teaching future generations the lessons of instinct and restraint. The same patterns that haunted sleep shaped ceremony, law, and myth. The nocturnal world was not separate. It informed the waking one. Yet dreams also reveal the fragility of control. Even in slumber, the boundaries between human and beast were porous. The unconscious could not be fully commanded. Transformation was always possible. The lessons were humbling. Civilization may demand restraint, but it cannot eliminate instinct. The animal within persists, echoing through night, through story, and through memory. Dreams of fur and claw remind humanity of what daylight obscures. They are warnings, rehearsals, and reckonings. They assert that fear, desire, and instinct are not failures. They are inheritances. And though humans may awaken to walls, laws, and fire, the body and imagination carry the wilderness within, waiting for the next night, the next shadow, the next heartbeat. Because even in the most orderly world, the mind remembers what the body has always known. That beneath thought, beneath reason, beneath identity, the animal waits, patient and eternal, ready to run in dreams when humans sleep. As humans began to measure themselves against their own reflection, fear transformed once more. No longer was it only the night, the forest, or the predator that threatened. Civilization had created a new mirror, one that reflected humanity's own potential for savagery. In glass, in water, in polished bronze, humans confronted the shadow of themselves. The impulses, the hunger, the violence that reason could not fully contain. The mirror is a quiet witness. In early societies, reflective surfaces were rare and sacred. Pools of water, polished metals, and obsidian stones offered glimpses of the self, but glimpses with consequences. To see oneself was to recognize capacity for both creation and destruction. And when the gaze lingered too long, it revealed the parts of human nature usually hidden: rage, envy, lust, and cruelty. In these moments, the animal within became visible, uncanny, and frightening. Myth codified this uncanny recognition. Across cultures, stories arose of humans transformed by their own reflection. The narcissist consumed by vanity. The man who sees a beast where he should see himself. Spirits and demons often mimic or distort human appearance, showing a shadow self ungoverned by reason. These narratives were not about vanity or vanity alone. They were warnings of instinct unrestrained, shame unresolved, and fear denied. Psychologically, the mirror served as a threshold. It externalized internal danger, giving form to impulses too complex to articulate. Rage could be projected, desire could be objectified, and guilt could be experienced at a distance. In encountering the distorted self, humans practiced a subtle negotiation, acknowledgement without surrender. Fear was no longer only survival-oriented. It became moral, reflective, and anticipatory. This process shaped ritual and culture. Masks, once used to summon the animal safely, now reflected it metaphorically. Theater, storytelling, and portraiture explored human duality. Characters became embodiments of internal conflict. Humans with claws, humans with fangs, humans whose desires outstripped their reason. Society codified these lessons through myth, teaching the young how to recognize and restrain the shadow that mirrored them. Yet the mirror is also seductive. The fascination with the self, with the animal within, carries a quiet danger. To look too long is to risk identification, to risk admiration or envy of the instincts one should control. It is no coincidence that monsters, demons, and shapeshifters frequently confront protagonists with reflections of their own desires and failures. Recognition is both warning and temptation. The human is drawn to the beast within, even while fearing it. Anthropologists note that this awareness marks a turning point in consciousness. Where instinct had once been bodily and immediate, and ritual had mediated transformation, Reflection introduced morality, guilt, and projection. The animal was no longer simply externalized. It became internalized, self-conscious, and symbolic. Humans had created a framework to observe themselves, and in doing so, to judge themselves. Civilizations codified this awareness into law, art, and religion, but the shadow remained. It lived in memory, in ritual, and in the imagination. Every story of transformation, every cautionary tale of greed or rage, carries the echo of this early encounter. The human is both observer and observed, protector and predator, reason and instinct intertwined in perpetual tension. And so the mirror never lies entirely, nor entirely reassures. It reflects what humans have always known, that beneath civility, beneath law, beneath reason, lies the pulse of the animal. That identity is layered, fragile, and negotiable. That the line between self and shadow is porous, and that sometimes the reflection moves before the observer does. Even now, when we peer into glass or water, the lesson endures. The beast waits, not in forest, not only in myth, but in ourselves. Even as cities rose, laws multiplied, and philosophy sought to explain the human heart, the impulse to become animal never disappeared. It retreated, quiet but persistent, into ritual, story, and imagination. Where civilization demanded restraint, culture provided masks, metaphorical and literal, that allowed humans to explore instinct without surrendering identity. The animal within was not vanquished. It was encoded, preserved, and ceremonially released. Masks serve many purposes. In festivals, dances, and initiations, humans donned faces of fur, horn, and tooth. They became the predator, the hunted, the trickster, the revered spirit. These enactments were not mere play. They were negotiations with fear, with instinct, with memory. The mask allowed what society forbade: expression of desire, rage, and ferocity in structured, symbolic form. It permitted humans to confront their own shadow safely, to touch what reason could not permit, and to return to civility intact. Anthropological records show the persistence of this practice across continents and eras. From the elaborate masks of Africa and Oceania to the ceremonial garb of the Americas and Eurasia, humans sought embodiment of the other, the wild, and the feared. Even when the act itself lost its original ritual context, its symbolic weight endured. Masks became reminders. The animal within is never gone. It is only waiting for recognition, for expression, for permission. Psychologically, these practices manage duality. The human mind craves structure, yet instinct demands outlet. When denied, it erupts chaotically. When guided, it can teach, heal, and bond communities. Masks mediate this tension. They create safe boundaries for fear, for aggression, for desire, allowing expression without consequence. They are rituals of acknowledgement, not annihilation. Myth reinforces this continuity. Stories of shapeshifters, spirits, and trickster animals preserve the memory of these transformations. They caution, entertain, and instruct. They remind listeners that the line between human and animal is never fixed. A hero may take the form of a beast. A villain may betray a bestial impulse. Through narrative, culture allows the animal within to persist, even as civilization grows more complex. The endurance of masks reflects a fundamental truth. Humans are never entirely themselves, nor entirely other. Identity is layered, flexible, and negotiated. Every act of restraint is informed by memory of instinct. Every law, every taboo, every ritual encodes a recognition of what civilization cannot fully suppress. The animal waits not outside but inside, beneath skin, beneath thought, beneath consciousness. Even modern society, with its offices, screens, and city streets, retains echoes of this truth. Carnivals, role-play, performance, and art provide outlets for impulses that daily life constrains. Fear and desire, aggression and cunning, all return in controlled forms. We call them entertainment, culture, or fantasy, but they are, at their root, continuations of the ancient negotiation between civilization and instinct. And so the masks persist. They teach restraint, reveal possibility, and acknowledge what humans cannot wholly deny. They remind us that fear is not only external but internal. That instinct is not failure but inheritance. That identity is flexible, layered, and sometimes wild. The animal is never gone. It waits beneath thought, beneath skin, beneath the rituals we call civilization. And when we dare to wear the mask, we remember. It is not imitation. It is acknowledgement. It is recognition of what has always lived within. Time flows, civilizations rise and fall, and yet the memory of the animal within endures. It is older than law, older than ritual, older than story itself. The beast is not a relic of the past. It is a pulse beneath the surface of humanity, a quiet insistence that instinct, hunger, and fear are inseparable from reason, culture, and identity. To forget it is impossible. To deny it is perilous. Across millennia, humans have sought to shape, suppress, and explain the animal. Masks, myths, monsters, and moral codes all served as boundaries, as attempts to contain what they could not eliminate. Yet despite centuries of civilization, the pulse remains. It survives in the mind's shadows, in the edge of a forest, in the fever of dreams, in the flare of emotion that reason cannot fully command. The beast remembers us, and we remember it. History preserves these lessons in art, story, and ritual. Cave walls, temple reliefs, folklore, and festival dances all testify to an enduring truth. Fear is not only external. It is internal, ancestral, and embodied. The animal is a mirror, reflecting what humans have always known, that strength, ferocity, desire, and violence are not foreign to the self, but intrinsic to it. Civilization does not erase these impulses. It negotiates with them, channels them, codifies them into myth. Psychologically, the persistence of the beast reveals a paradox. Humans have mastered tools, cultivated societies, and built empires. Yet they remain vulnerable to impulses their minds cannot fully command. Anger erupts, desire tempts, fear dominates. These surges are reminders that instinct is never truly suppressed, only deferred, disciplined, and redirected. The beast is memory made flesh, pulse made thought, fear made story. Even today, monsters, myths, and rituals echo these truths. Werewolves, shapeshifters, skinwalkers, and demonic hybrids endure in imagination and popular culture not because people fear fiction, but because they recognize instinct within themselves. The narratives are cautionary, yet intimate. They teach restraint, acknowledge potential, and reflect the perpetual tension between human reason and animal impulse. To encounter such figures is to glimpse a self unmasked, instinctual, and enduring. The beast also carries wisdom. Its presence reminds humans of limits, resilience, and the necessity of respect, for themselves, for each other, and for the natural world. Ancient hunters, ritual dancers, shamans, and storytellers all understood this. The beast is teacher as well as threat, guide as well as caution. It survives because it is essential to understanding humanity's origins, fears, and capacities. In the quietest moments, when fear flares unexpectedly, when dreams turn dark, when instinct overrides deliberation, the memory of the beast surfaces. It does not come to punish or to dominate. Comes to remind. To remind humans that they are layered creatures, composed of reason and instinct, civilization and wildness, thought and pulse. To remember the animal is to remember oneself. And so the story concludes, not with triumph over fear, but with recognition. The animal that once prowled forests, wore masks, inspired gods, and haunted dreams still walks within us. Its claws, teeth, and shadows are no longer merely external. They are part of the human soul. To deny it is to live half-remembered. To acknowledge it is to understand the depth, complexity, and endurance of being human. The beast is remembered. It waits, patient and eternal, beneath thought, beneath law, beneath identity. And in remembering it, humanity remembers itself.